Welcome to our very last lecture, everybody. In this particular lecture, we're going to be covering a new topic of moral development. Now, I know many of our modules have had two lectures associated with them, but much like the last module, I want you to get some outside information on this specific topic. So instead of me lecturing on two different areas of interest within this umbrella topic, I'm going to have you watch this video, which will be a little bit longer than some of the previous ones, but not extremely long in comparison to some like the last one. But in addition to that, I want you to make sure that you go over the book in detail on this specific topic. And that's because the author explores a topic that I'm not 100% comfortable talking about in lecture, and it's kind of the overlap between moral development and religious development. Now, there are some opinion-based things that are covered in that specific reading, and I want you to make sure that you're going through it and thinking for yourself as you're going through that material. But I feel as though if you really want to get the full breadth of the material, making sure that you do go through those readings is important. So instead of me droning on about moral development and then having you have that separate topic that's not covered in the lectures, I want to just make sure that I get to the heart of the material in this lecture and then give you that chance, that opportunity to read more about spiritual development and change and growth and how these things also can relate to lifespan development. So without further ado, let's get started on our very last lecture for the class. When we start talking about moral development, it's critical to first define what it means to be moral, or what morality is all about. When we're talking about morality, there's a lot of things embedded within it. But at the heart of it is this kind of idea of there being some sense of right and wrong. And moral development is all about developing things related to that sense of right and wrong. What develops is very multifaceted. Usually, when people think of moral development, they just talk about how people, as they age and progress, become more moral in their actions. They do things that are more aligned with standards that are set forth by society, or kind of that they've deemed are as important to them and their morality of whatever they've decided is right and wrong. Obviously, there's lots of gray zones, and we're going to get to that as we progress. But this idea of morality being linked to behaviors is typically where lots of people start. But if we look a little bit more closely at morality and change, we understand when talking about development that there's other things that are critical beyond just kind of behaving in a moral way. One of the things that we first have to be able to develop before we can talk about behaving morally is what it means to be moral, or what standards of morality are there. And when we're talking about how we develop, forming those standards is one of the first steps we have to take. There's also things revolving around what outcomes can come from moral versus amoral behaviors that we have to develop. And there is lots of gray zones once we get into morality that do need to be discovered, and this is a big component to moral development. So in essence, even though morality is just about being in the right or kind of understanding the difference between right and wrong, I want you to understand that when we talk about moral development, there's lots of aspects to morality that we can explore and lots of things that can be related to kind of a lack of morals or kind of a different moral compass than what one would expect somebody to have. We're looking at where research on morality development came from. We actually get to go back to one of our more familiar individuals, somebody we've discussed extensively in numerous sections of this class, that wonderful researcher named Jean Piaget, who, when he worked on development in children, did allude to moral development, just not quite as much as a lot of the other cognitive changes that we looked at earlier in previous sections. His belief was that when we're born, we're essentially not horrible individuals, but just people that are devoid of understanding of morality. If anything, we're kind of just learning the rules as we go along. But he said by the time we get to around 5, 6, 7, we start to develop some sense of morality. It's just our understanding of morality, much like our cognitive understanding of a lot of things, is extremely flawed when we first start creating our first schemas of what it means to be moral. And his argument was that many children kind of start to form the same rules when it comes to morality that are just imperfect. And he said that most kids, when they're around 5 and up to about the age of 9, display what he called heteronymous morality. It's this belief that there is a right and wrong, and essentially, this right and wrong is absolute. There's no changing rules. These rules have been there forever, and essentially anybody who disobeys those rules is going to get themselves in trouble. This relates to another idea that we call imminent justice. This notion that at some point, if you do something wrong, you're going to get caught, and essentially anybody who's been punished obviously did something wrong. And more importantly, this is another big important component to heteronymous morality, that whatever that person did wrong was obviously, sorry, was obviously intentional. And this also relates to a really interesting concept that lots of researchers look at in social psychology called the just world phenomenon. It's this notion that anybody who's had a bad thing happen to them is probably somebody that deserves that bad thing that's happened to them. Uh, it's kind of the inklings of heteronymous morality within this theory. It's just something we usually ascribe to adults. Many people have argued when looking at Piaget's take on early morality that maybe when people start to talk about this, when they look at people of lower socioeconomic statuses that have lots of horrible punitive things done to them, or individuals who have kind of struggled because of a multitude of different reasons over the years, they might kind of blame these individuals who are struggling with this because they're not quite past this heteronymous morality stage of development. It wouldn't necessarily align with Piaget's take on the topic, because much like what we saw with cognitive development, Piaget was a firm believer that eventually all of us got past this type of moral thinking. It was at around 9 to 10 that we developed into another area of was defined by Piaget as autonomous morality. He said that somewhere around 9 to 10 years of age, we started to transition into this type of moral thinking, and we started to change some of the beliefs about morality that we had. Essentially, we still keep that idea of right and wrong, but we start to recognize that right and wrong is sometimes sort of socially described or defined. We start to believe that essentially rules are there for a purpose, but they're being set by specific individuals. And this can sometimes lead to obsessions with many kids about rule creating. In fact, you might have been around a third grader, fourth grader who's getting into this, that suddenly starts obsessing about creating games with lots of rules and making sure people follow rules, because they're just realizing at that moment that rules are not these inherent set in stone things. They're things that can be created and altered. Maybe is important to note here that there's lots of research that suggests that some kids can become obsessed with rules and creating them long before they reach the age of 9. And there's many kids that maybe don't get into this phase like Piaget described, but nonetheless, his indications were that this was kind of a marker of kids transitioning to this new level of morality, where we saw the social kind of factors within morality. And he also said that when kids start to recognize this, they're also recognizing that punishment is not imminent when somebody breaks the rules. He described this as fallible justice, this notion that sometimes people are still immoral even if they're not necessarily getting caught for their actions. And it's also related to this idea that intentionality is a component to whether or not somebody's being moral. Essentially, it's saying you don't have to always get caught for you to be immoral, but you do have to be trying to do what you were doing for it to be described as immoral. And this relates to not only intentionality, but the kind of awareness of some moral constraint related to the behavior that's being dictated or that's being displayed. And this growth, this transition into autonomous morality, according to Piaget, took time. but he said eventually all of us kind of got to this place where we all had pretty much the same moral understanding. It's just different standards that we were all being guided by on our daily lives. But it meant if we saw a situation that related to morality, we'd probably all judge it in the same way. And this led to lots of research where people looked at how individuals would judge the behaviors of others differently, say in terms of the lack of or the strength in morality in a situation. To kind of understand what I'm alluding to here, I thought we could do two quick activities. So in this first activity, I'm going to describe a situation that relates to two individuals, two gentlemen named Gary and Kenny, who happen to, in this situation, stop off at a gas station to pick up sodas. But they find out when they go to the counter that they were intending to pay with a credit card, but the cashier tells them that that score, for some inexplicable reason, only accepts cash. So Gary and Kenny, being two individuals who really want that soda, apparently, decide to run out of the store with the sodas. But unfortunately for Kenny, he gets caught while Gary gets away. Now, if I were to ask you to rate the morality of Gary on a scale of 1 to 10 and the morality of Kenny on a scale of 1 to 10, my guess is that, and I'm guessing you're doing this right now in your head real quick, you probably rate them equally in terms of their morality. Now, some of you might consider the fact that they had intended to pay with a credit card when determining the morality, and therefore maybe gave them a score of, say, in terms of their morality, 1 being very low, 10 being very high, something like a 3 or a 4. Now, with the expectation that there was some intent to pay behind it. Others, when hearing about shoplifting, might automatically say this is a 1. This is extremely immoral, regardless of who they are. But I'm also guessing that many of you probably rated Gary and Kenny the same, regardless of the fact that Kenny got caught. Now, if we gave this test to a young child, we would probably find that Kenny getting caught might have an impact on their judgment of Kenny. Oddly enough, they might have kind of concluded that Kenny was more amoral in the situation than Gary. And it's not until around 9 and 10 that kids start to grapple with this and really do start to understand that these two should be probably kind of judged equally in this situation. This is the kind of stuff that people looked at when they looked at these ideas of Piaget's, and they started kicking the tires, trying to figure out if there was more that Piaget didn't look at. To give you another example of other things that we could look at, I thought I'd give you two final scenarios that both relate. Say in this particular situation that you've got two people, both who are taking a similar test. There's a girl named Becky and a girl named Erica who have this final exam. They're both worried about it, and they decide to try to kind of overcome their worry in two different ways. Becky decides to try to overcome her fear of this final by studying a lot, studying extensively up to the exam. And on the day of the exam, Becky walks in and has her professor, unfortunately, post all of the answers on an overhead screen. She essentially posts the answer key to the exam on an overhead screen and tells the class, please don't look at the screen. The answers are there, and I'm going to try to get it down, but they're up there right now. And Becky decides at that moment, because she's so stressed, to quickly jot down all of the answers to the exam on a sheet of paper so she can just copy them over later on. You've also got another person named Erica who's taking the same exam, just at a different time. So she doesn't have the professor put up the answers on the screen. And instead of studying, though, Erica decides to steal a copy of the exam, copy down all the answers for the exam on her arm, and go in and take it with that kind of information on hand. And unfortunately for Erica, the day of the exam, it starts to rain, her arm gets wet, and when she arrives to take the exam, she finds that all of the answers that she had written down on her arm had washed away, so she doesn't get a chance to cheat. Now, there's a lot embedded within these two examples, but I'm guessing that most of you could probably ballpark your judgment of morality of Becky and Erica in these situations. And oddly enough, even though Becky was the one that got to cheat, I'm guessing that you might consider Becky's behavior more honest than Erica's in this situation. It's really interesting, though, when we kind of try to unravel this, why you did this, where you went to. And a lot of the things that we've already talked about with Piaget could probably I'm also guessing that you recognize that there's some things that you explored, some things you considered that Piaget's work never really tackled. And this is what lots of other theorists and researchers started to contend when looking at the work of Piaget's. One champion of this idea was a gentleman named Lawrence Kohlberg, who argued that even though Piaget definitely hit on some key concepts related to morality, and other people talked about additional things that related to morality, his general sense of development was kind of imperfect. Kohlberg said it's not that we're kind of amoral until we're around 5, but very imperfectly moral until we're around 9 or 10, and then everything's great. He said instead, probably just like we have cognitive stages of development, also progress through moral stages of development. And essentially, we turn our attention to different things in different situations that allow us to kind of see moral quandaries or moral problems differently based on where we're at in our development. And to test where people are in terms of their stages of moral development, Kohlberg devised his own scenarios, his own examples that he would put kids through. They're going to get a gauge of where they were currently at their age in terms of moral development. How he tested kids, I thought I'd put up one of my favorite examples from Kohlberg's called The Story of Heinz. It's one that's often cited in many intro classes, but kind of works very well for this class as well. In the story of Heinz, you learn about a gentleman named Heinz whose wife is near death from a special kind of cancer. There was apparently in this hypothetical scenario one drug that doctors thought might save her. There was this new special experimental drug that a druggist in some town had recently developed, and the drug was very expensive to make, but the druggist was charging a lot for this particular drug. So essentially, it cost the druggist around $2,000 for all the ingredients to produce this new type of radium, but they were charging $20,000 for just a tiny dose of the drug. It was probably going to cost even more over the long run, in essence. So the sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everybody he knew to borrow money so he could at least start the treatments for his wife. But all he was able to compile was $10,000. Just go with me here. I know there's probably other ways to get more money and all that other stuff. Let's just say for now, Heinz could only get about $10,000, which was what half of what the druggist was charging, but obviously a lot more than what the druggist would have paid to develop it. He told the druggist that his wife was dying, asked him to sell it for cheaper or just let him pay later, but the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So Heinz got desperate, broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should the husband have done that? Why or why not? Now, I'm sure many of you, when you see that scenario, start problem solving and thinking of all these alternative things that Heinz could have done or said or whatever. But that's not what Kohlberg was asking people to do. He was essentially bringing kids into the room and saying, yes or no. Was this a moral behavior of Heinz, or should Heinz have done that? I guess not. Was it moral? And then he asked the kids to explain their answers. And that explanation was a thing that he keyed in on. The yes or no, it was interesting. But the explanation, he said, was it was indicated where the child was along their kind of moral development. And he contended that stages of moral development, but he kind of simplified it eventually and talked about what he called 3 levels of moral development. Because sometimes the kind of intermixing between some of the stages got a little tough to differentiate. So he said the first level of moral development, when we're 5, 6, 7, all the way until around 9 or 10, we often display what he called pre-conventional moral reasoning, where we look towards rules, we look at punishment, and we use those guideposts to determine whether or not somebody is being moral. So in the case of Hines, essentially, if somebody would have said, no, he shouldn't do that because he'd get caught, or because the rules say don't do that, or yes, because, it's your job as, well, no, it's a little tough. Yes, because he wanted it, I guess, would be the kind of a pre-conventional response as well. So you can say yes or no, and it can be defined as the pre-conventional moral. So again, the yes or no didn't matter. But if you're focusing on kind of getting caught, or whether or not you're getting what you want, you're in what he called the pre-conventional stage of morality. He said as kids got a little bit older, they would transition to what he called conventional morality, where rules and relationships and roles start to play a bigger role. So it's not whether or not you would get caught as much as, it's against the rule to steal, or it's your responsibility as a husband, something I was going to say previously, but that actually is more of a conventional response, to kind of make sure that you're protecting your spouse. These types of responses, again, yes or no, didn't matter, but these types of responses that focused on social roles, on relationships, those kinds of things, Kohlberg argued would be indicative of conventional moral reasoning. And he argued many individuals, by the time they got into their early teenage years, even around 11, 12 sometimes, would start to give responses that indicated they had transitioned into this conventional level. And again, there's two stages within the conventional level. One focuses on the kind of law and duties, and the other on relationships. It's tough to differentiate between those, honestly, sometimes. Just so you see it, I included it in this. But if you're giving responses that relate to these things, you're at the conventional level. Many individuals eventually will get to something that he called post-conventional moral reasoning, where we talk more about kind of universal ideas and principles. So if you say something like life should always be valued over money, or if society would fall apart if people start doing things what they want, or doing the things they want without thinking about consequences, those would be, according to Kohlberg, kind of responses that were indicative of the final level of moral development. And again, there are two sub-stages in it, or two stages, I guess, within this level that are sometimes tough to differentiate. But if we break down research looking at Kohlberg's ideas, what we see is something that's kind of intriguing. It seems to, in testing kids, pan out that many children around the age of 8, 9, when they're just kind of at that cusp of the next stage of moral development, according to Piaget, providing what we would call pre-conventional level responses. So when they're asked, should Hines have stolen, regardless of whether or not they say yes or no, their focus will be on getting punished or getting what you want. As kids get to around 11, 12 and are theoretically transitioning through that next stage of moral development so they can think like everybody else, a lot of their responses seem to be more on the conventional side of things. And then as kids get even older, around 15, 16, 17, there is this uptick in lots of post-conventional responses that are given. And all of this suggests that maybe Kohlberg was sort of on to something. Now, it's important to note that unlike Piaget, Kohlberg stressed that some people maybe never get to the post-conventional level. Actually, many people never get to the post-conventional level. And it's not inherent that all of us have to hit certain points at certain ages. But, it added a new wrinkle, and almost an addition to Piaget's ideas of moral development. Piaget's concepts brought in a lot of critique. When people looked at his theories of moral development, many people started to contend that maybe what Kohlberg was doing was actually showing that his set of focuses, or his shows of development, had have highlighted how a lot of Piaget's ideas of moral development might be more intertwined with his ideas of cognitive development than many people had originally thought. Lots of people started to argue that essentially what people were doing when responding in these ways is showing where their focus was. When we're around 8, 9, 10, most of us at that age are really focused on the self and getting whatever we want out of every situation. As we get into our early teenage years, or even around 11 or 12, we start to transition our focus to social roles and groups that we're a part of. And then as we get into, say, our high school years and beyond, we start to, if we're going to develop these types of thinking, and of focusing on society as a whole and social systems, not just the groups that we're a part of. And that is manifested in a lot of the responses that people give. It's not that we're becoming more moral, is what these researchers would argue. It's just, well, our focus has shifted to a different thing. Another very interesting kind of rebuke of these ideas of kind of these natural progressions of moral development that Kohlberg suggested is this notion that maybe what we're looking at here is just people learning these things from the society that they're a part of. There's been a number of studies that have suggested that certain cultures don't seem to show the same progressions and the same focuses as what we see in the United States. And our assumptions that this means that those cultures, those individuals are less moral because they're not progressing in this way is very egocentric. Essentially, some have argued that some cultures that value social norms and rules and making sure that everybody follows those things because of either some spiritual being or this kind of innate focus on being sure that we're kind of helping our society and our group out, shouldn't be judged harshly. Essentially, we should just say that in that culture, that society, that's their definition of the highest level of morality. And another really interesting wrinkle that's popped up in this is the fact that when Piaget talked about his work and Kohlberg talked about his work, most of their focus was on kind of the academic side of things, where they would present people with hypothetical scenarios and ask them to explain what another person should do. Doesn't necessarily reflect all the time in what these individuals themselves are doing. And some have argued that if we're going to talk about moral development, maybe we really should focus our attention a little bit more on the behavioral side of things, not just what people are saying. And when we do that, what we often find is that even though 12 and 13-year-olds might be able to say what's moral and what's not in a way that aligns a little bit more with our adult forms of thinking, that doesn't mean that their actions are dramatically shifting when they get to that age. It's just their cognitive understanding of it might have shifted a little bit. And if we look a little bit closer at kind of how this develops, bringing it back to what we're talking about in kind of these span development classes, what we see is a lot of the traditional catalysts seem to be there. Both Kohlberg and Piaget stressed the need for social interactions, Kohlberg highlighting that they could speed us through, Piaget just saying that these things were not done in a vacuum. You needed a social world to develop morally. And what we also see from their work is kind of manifested in lots of research that growths in thinking, growths in understanding and social interaction really were the catalyst for the growth that we tend to see in kids. But lots of other researchers have looked for kind of more concrete, specific things that could be kind of indicators of some of the changes that we see at different ages. And well, we've discovered a lot through one of the lenses of kind of personality research and other research that we've referenced earlier. Remember back a few modules ago, we talked about theorists that looked at something called the social cognitive perspective of growth. Behaviorists also kind of tap into this idea a little bit as well. If you've heard of that branch of psychology or read about it in our textbook where it's referenced a few times, these individuals have argued that maybe when we're talking about moral growth and development, what we're really looking at is a kind of a social growth that kids undergo as they're progressing throughout their lives, kind of linked to the idea of personality and other topics that we discussed in earlier sections of this particular portion of the class. Essentially, what these researchers argue is that when kids are growing and learning, they're kind of trying to figure out who they are. Essentially, they're trying to get a sense of what a range of morality actually means. So, what it means to be a 1 to a 10 on morality, what they're like in different situations, and then also which situations kind of dictate what it means to be moral. This is really interesting when we think about this conceptually. Yeah, we've kind of considered morality as this overarching thing that bleeds into every situation. But lots of social cognitive psychologists have argued that many individuals don't even consider morality in certain moments. When we talk about treatment of specific groups of individuals or behaviors in certain situations, what one person might define as completely immoral, another person might not even think about morality in that particular situation. The classic example is when you drive and somebody does something that really offends one individual, makes them describe the other person as a complete jerk or a horribly immoral person. The other person doesn't even realize that what they're doing would even be judged on a moral scale. This relates to another idea that was explored by a social cognitive theorist named Lawrence Walker called moral exemplars, where essentially he argued that many kids, when they're developing, not only learn to focus on certain things when it comes to morality, but they learn to focus on these things by trying to essentially emulate specific characters that they've been exposed to that they kind of speak to their definition of what's important to be moral and what's not. The classic example of this is Robin Hood, and the one that I always love to reference is the child's version of Robin Hood that many of you might have seen, the Disney version with the fox that played Robin Hood. And essentially, what Walker argued is that kids being exposed to this particular character when they were developing might have been a big catalyst in the child's thinking of what we needed to pay attention to when it came to morality and the situations that kind of brought to mind the needs to think about morality. Now, this also relates to another idea that social cognitive theorists look at a lot called competencies, and of looking for certain situations to display skill sets and then specific skill sets. This is what competencies are about, that we develop so we can navigate within those social situations that we're looking for. What more researchers in the social cognitive area would argue is that these moral competencies kind of are everywhere. We look for situations in school that we use to determine what's moral and what's not, and we develop our skill sets that kind of relate to our understanding of morality in that situation. We maybe have certain things that we're looking for in our family behaviors, or when we're out with friends, or when we're, say, at the zoo, or engaging with other individuals in certain situations where we in our own mind kind of are looking for what's defined as moral and what's not, and have developed a specific skill set so we can make sure that we're aligning to our own standards of morality. Now, social cognitive theorists would argue that for us to have these things, these moral competencies, these kind of understandings of ranges of morality, and these moral exemplars, we need growth, we need time, we need exposure to these different things. And it's kind of a lifelong process that they argue would kind of need to occur, especially in childhood into. Now, other researchers have focused on kind of sources of this information or that would result in some of the competencies or skill sets that we talked about earlier. One of the main areas that many researchers have looked at in terms of moral growth is how important peers and social systems are. Numerous studies have actually seemed to support Kohlberg's and Piaget's suggestions that the most critical player in a lot of moral development is a child's peers. There's numerous heritability studies where researchers have looked for shared environments and genetic factors that might explain ranges in moral behavior of kids that have all suggested that the most important factor is the unshared environment, and the most critical component to the unshared environment for kids is often peers, friends. Essentially, the groups we're forming at very young ages have a big impact on our understanding of morality and our understanding of what it means to even be moral. Parents do play a small role in this as well. There's numerous studies that have shown that modeling can be very effective. Empowering kids to think about morality and do things that allow them to behave morally or not is big, and also cocooning them, kind of protecting them from situations that might really tempt them and cause them to behave in amoral ways and question themselves is all kind of a combination of things that could potentially really help kids behave more morally. Another concept that has been introduced a lot recently, since we recognize the importance of peers, is this approach called pre-arming, where parents essentially try to walk through kids' scenarios, or walk their kids through scenarios where they might be challenged morally by their peers. Let's go out and do this thing, or let's do this mean thing to somebody, or let's, not listen to so and so about this. And essentially, they walk their kids through this, try to get them to think of good responses and think about what their behaviors would indicate. So when they do encounter those situations in the future with their peers, they can usually be a little bit more capable of resisting temptations or doing the things that they've decided they want to do. Now, there are other structures that can help beyond just the family and friends. There's lots of research that suggested that early school environments can really help a child understand what it means to be moral in their own mind. And there's lots of programs that have been devised to specifically help kids grow morally. There's lots of after school programs, there's lots of within school programs, lots of kind of volunteer groups that have intentionally gone out and tried to recruit kids with this notion that if you can get kids to develop their moral skills and their moral compass at an early age, that can transition to them being more moral in adolescence and beyond, and theoretically create a much nicer environment. Or other institutions that tend to be tied to morality, this is when we start getting to what the book is going to discuss extensively, when we start linking morality to religious beliefs or some type of growth in spirituality. It's definitely difficult to argue that these things are not intertwined. It's just whether or not they have to be related is something that there is a bit of debate on. And this is where I'm going to allow you to make sure that you read the book and get the author's take on this specific topic without having me put too much of my own kind of opinions and ideas of what I kind of think of when it comes to morality into this material. But understand that, yeah, this is one of the big areas that we tend to link to morality, but there's other ones out there that go beyond just school, family, and friends. There's lots of cognitive psychologists that have looked at kind of the moments of introspection and personal thought that could potentially be sources of big changes in morality, and even specific events, encounters that kids might have that could shape their morality in kind of unforeseen ways. Those huge kind of markers in a person's life that maybe are the source of a lot of moral development that we see in kids. But understand that these are all things that make our understanding of moral development a little bit more complex than Piaget or Kohlberg ever thought. And it also makes it really tough to talk about the specific timelines when people develop morally, because what we tend to see with moral development is there are so many factors like religion, like school, like peers, like life events that seem to be pushing us in different directions in terms of our moral behavior and our understanding of morality, that's saying when we hit this age where this level of morality is just not something we're capable of doing. It doesn't make it something we shouldn't study. It just, again, makes it a little bit more complex. So I encourage you to make sure that you've done the readings and gone over this, and hopefully by the time you're done, you have a really good sense of how interesting and complex this topic of moral development actually is. Or not, when you're done with that, you are, congratulations, done with the material for this class. Doesn't mean we're done with the class, right? You still have a number of things to do. Make sure you're checking the syllabus so you understand exactly what needs to be done and what the timelines are. But this is going to mark the end of the material for this class. So thank you very much for sticking through everything. I wish you the best of luck with everything that still remains in the class. And if you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me. But for now, I guess this is our final goodbye. So take care all, and maybe I'll see you around sometime.